Section 15 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Yearsley. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. On Digging Holes. When all the world was young, and we were young with it, there was no occupation more pleasing to our infant minds than the digging of great holes in that placid and maternal earth that endured the trampling of our childish feet with patience, and betrayed no realization of the extraordinary miracle of life that had set us dancing in the fields and valleys of the world. As repentant children trace with curious finger on their mothers' foreheads the lines that they themselves have set there, so we followed the furrows on the forehead of our Mother Earth with our little spades, smoothing here and deepening there, and not the less contented that our labours had but a vague and illusory aim. Sometimes, perhaps, we had a half-formed ambition to dig to those dim and incredible antipodes, where children walk head downwards, clinging to the earth with their feet like the flies on the playroom ceiling. Sometimes, perhaps, we dug for treasure, immense masses of golden coin, like those memorable hoards described in Treasure Island and The Gold Bug. Or again, it might be that we planned vast caves and galleries, wherein tawny pirates and swart smugglers might carouse, shocking the echoes with blood-curdling oaths, and drinking boiling rum like Quilp. We dug, in fine. There seems to be some element in the human mind that is definitely attracted by the digging of holes, for it is not only children who are interested by the spectacle. The genial excavators whose duty it is to make havoc of the London streets never fail to draw an attentive and apparently appreciative audience. Whether of loafers or philosophers the critic may not lightly determine. They gaze into the pit with countenances of abysmal profundity, that appear to see all, to understand all, and to express nothing in particular. It is possible that they are placidly enjoying the reflection that beneath the complex contrivances of our civilization, beneath London itself, the virgin earth lies unturned and unaffected. Perhaps, as each spadeful of earth reaches the surface, they perceive, like a child watching the sawdust trickle from the broken head of a doll, that here is the raw material of which worlds are made. Perhaps they do not think at all, but merely derive a mild satisfaction from watching other people work. Yet it is at least agreeable to believe that they are watchers for the unexpected, and that they have discovered the great truth that if you dig long enough, you will probably dig something up. We children knew this very well, and we never dug without feeling the thrill proper to treasure seekers. Even half a brick becomes eventful when found in these circumstances, and the earth had 100 pleasant secrets, in the shape of fragments of pottery, mysterious lumps of metal, and excited insects, for those who approached her reverently, trowel in hand. It was this variety of treasure that made us prefer inland digging to those more fashionable excavations that are carried on at the seaside. Sand is a friendly substance in which to dig, and it is very convenient to have a supply of water, like the sea, close at hand when it is necessary to fill a pond or add a touch of realism to a moat. But the ease with which sand obeys the spade soon becomes monotonous, and the seaside in general suffers from an air of having been elaborately prepared for children to play there. Our delving operations in the garden had the charm of nominal illegality, and the brown earth had 100 moods to thwart and help and enchant us continually. Sometimes we dug with scientific precision. Sometimes we set to work with fury, flinging the earth to all sides in our eagerness to rob her of her secrets. A philosopher might have found in us a striking instance of the revolt of civilized man against nature. A woman would have noticed that we were getting our pinafores dirty. And though we liked digging for its own sake, we were not unmindful of the possibilities of a good big hole. From its cool depths we could obtain a new aspect of the sky, and, cunningly roofed over with branches and earth, it made a snug retreat for a harassed brigand, and a surprising pitfall for the unwary gardener. In smaller cavities we concealed treasure, of stones decked with the colours left behind by the painters at the last spring cleaning, and if we could not wholly convince ourselves of their intrinsic value, they at least bore adequate resemblance to the treasures of Aladdin's cave, as revealed to us in pantomime. We kept the knowledge of the spots where these treasures were buried a close secret, even from each other, and it was etiquette for the finder of one of these repositories to remove its contents and conceal them elsewhere. The conflict between seeker and finder never languished, and men who rose up millionaires would go to bed paupers. Like all sincere artists, we did not allow our own efforts to hinder a just appreciation of those of others, and we had the utmost admiration for rabbits, down whose enchanted burrows we would peer longingly, reflecting wisely how fine a home it must be that had so romantic and fascinating an entrance. For us, half the charm of Alice lay in the natural and sensible means by which she reached her wonderland, though we could never bring ourselves to forgive the author for pretending that his clearly veracious narrative was only a dream. This, we recognised, was an obvious grown-up device for preventing the youthful from slipping away from governesses to wonderlands of their own, and true enough we found rabbit-holes oddly reluctant to admit our small bodies, even though we widened their mouths with our trowels. Looking-glasses, it may be mentioned, proved no less refractory, and at this day, it is said, children find it impossible to emulate the flying feats of Peter Pan, though they carefully follow the directions. It is clear that these grown-up authors are not wholly straightforward with their youthful readers, but guard the Olympian interests by concealing some essential part of the ritual in these matters. Sooner or later the children find them out, and expel them from all nurseries, playrooms, gardens, and places where youth and wisdom congregate. But if we could not tread those long corridors into which the rabbits scuttled so featly on our approach, there was nothing to hinder us from digging a tunnel to fairyland of our own. The grand project formed, all the forces of the garden would unite, and we would dig seriously for an hour or so. At the end of that time, somebody's foot would be hurt by a spade, or some bright spirit would suggest that we should fill the hole with water and call it a lake. Or perhaps it would be tea time. At all events, we never got to fairyland at all. Or did we? As we grow old, our memories fade, but dimly I seem to remember a garden that was like no garden I have found in grown-up places. It is possible that we did reach fairyland, treading the same road that Alice and Cinderella and Aladdin had trod before us. Perhaps a grown-up writer may be pardoned for forgetting. End of section 15.
Section 16 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Real Cricket. I am willing to leave to other and more skilful hands the pleasure of narrating the joys and trials of county cricket, club cricket, and the splendid cricket of country houses and village greens. Not that my task is the more modest, for, having a just regard for relative values, I think that it is of cricket I write, such cricket as small boys play in dreams. Ah, me, those sixers that small boys hit in dreams. Such cricket as the ghosts enjoy at nights at Lord's. It is well for the eye to take pleasure in shining flannels and ivory white boots. There is a thrill in the science of the game, the swerve of the new red ball, the quick play of the batsman's feet. But I think that when good cricketers die, it is not to such elaborate sport as this that they betake themselves in the happy playing fields. to mow the astonished daisies in quick retort to the hardly gentlemanly sneak, to pull like Mr. Jessup because one knows no better, to be bowled by every straight Yorker, to slog at full pitches with close-shut eyes. Thus, and thus only, is the cricket of Arcadia. In its simplest form, we played it in the garden after dinner, but even here environment and our imaginations combined to make it complicated. The lawn was small, and there were flower beds and windows to be considered. The former did not trouble us very much. Indeed, we lopped the French lilies with a certain glee. But a broken window was a more serious business, and lofty drives to the off were therefore discouraged. Yet once, I recollect, the ball was sent through the same window 3 times in an afternoon. Of course, the unfortunate batsman who allowed his enthusiasm thus to outdrive his discretion was out, as also was he who hit the ball into the next garden. But this latter rule was rather conventional than imposed by necessity, for we were fortunate in the possession of a charming neighbour, and sometimes youth, adventuring in search of cricket balls, would be regaled with seed cake and still lemonade, and return rampant to his comrades. But the great zest of our games lay in our impersonation of real famous cricketers. We would take 2 county sides and divide the roles of their members amongst us, so that each of us would represent 2 or 3 members of each team. The score sheets of these matches would convey a strange impression to the erudition of the New Zealander, for the greatest cricketers failed to score frequently, and indeed inevitably, if they happened to be left-handed bats. So far our passion for accuracy carried us, but, like Tom Sawyer, we had to "lay on" that we bowled left-handed when it was in the part, while realistic impersonations of lightning bowlers were too dangerous to the batsman to be permitted. These great contests did not pass without minor disagreements. The rights of age were by no means waived, and in those days I was firmly convinced that the leg before wicket rule had been invented by the M.C.C. to assist elder brothers in getting their rights. Moreover, there was always high argument over the allocation of the parts of the more popular cricketers. My sister, I remember, would retire wrathfully from the game if she were not allowed to be K.J. Key, and so, when Surrey were playing, we had to permit her to be titular captain. Girls are very keen at cricket, but they are not good at it. Or, perhaps, in the course of the game, W.G. would find it necessary to chase Lockwood all over the field for bowling impudently well. Yet while we mimicked our elders, we secretly thought Olympian cricket a poor, unimaginative game without any quarrels. It was thrilling to bat for the honour of Mr. Fry, or to make a fine catch in the long field for Mr. Mason's sake, but our personal idiosyncrasies also had their value. When we went away for our holidays, it was ours to adventure with bat and ball on unaccustomed grounds. Meadow cricket was tiresome, for the ball would hide itself in the long grass, and seaside cricket, though exhilarating, was too public a business to be taken really seriously. But cricket in the pine woods was delightful, almost, I think, the best cricket of all. The soft needles made an admirable pitch, and we had all the trees for fielders. If you hit the ball against a tree full pitch, you were out, and it was strange how those patient, silent fieldsmen, who never dropped catches, seemed to arrange themselves, as the game progressed, in the conventional places in the field. Point would be there, and mid-off, and some safe men in the slips. Overhead the birds would call in the trees, and there were queer echoes when you hit the ball hard, as though Pan were watching from some dim pavilion and crying his applause. Really, I wonder how we dared, or perhaps it were fitter to wonder why we dare no longer. The oddest cricket I ever played was with a gardener, a reticent, impassive man who came and played with me when sudden mumps had exiled me from my holiday-making comrades. He would bowl to me silently for hours, only parting his lips now and again to murmur the name of the stump which he proposed to hit with his next ball, and no efforts of mine could prevent his grim prophecies from being fulfilled. When I gave him his innings, he would pat my widest and most wily balls back to me politely until he thought I was tired, and then he would let me bowl him. This unequal contest was not cricket as I knew it, but it fascinated me nevertheless. At night in my bed I would hit his bowling all over the world and upset his stumps with monotonous ease. By day I could only serve his humour. The devil was in the man. The bats with which we played were normal save in size, but the balls varied. In times of prosperity we had real leather cricket balls, but the balls known as "compos" were more common. When new they had a noble appearance, but use made them rough and like dry earth in the hand, and then they were apt to sting the fingers of the unwary cricketer. The most perilous kind of ball of all was the size of a cricket ball, but made of solid rubber, and deadly alike to batsman and fieldsman. For some reason or other, the proper place in which to carry a cricket ball was the trousers, or rather knickerbockers, pocket. The curious discomfort of this practice lingers in the mind. Soft balls are of no use in real cricket, but if you bore a hole in them and fill them with water, they make very good bombs for practical anarchists. Later came school cricket, but it is significant that the impression that lingers is of the long drives home in the dusk from our out matches rather than of the cricket itself. We would walk up the hills to rest the horses, playing touch and imprisoning unfortunate glowworms in wooden matchboxes. And later still came visits to Lord's and the Oval, when it was my fortune to see some of our old heroes in the flesh. Certainly they made more runs than they had been wont to do in the past, but it is not wise to examine our heroes too closely, though I am not alone in thinking that first-class cricketers are lacking a little in the old spirit. Indeed, how can they hope to keep it, they who are grown so wise? End of section 16.
Section 17 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Section 17. The Boy in the Garden. There were two kinds of gardening to employ our sunny hours. The one concerned with the vast tracts of the Olympians, the other with the cultivation of those intimate patches of earth known as the children's gardens, wherein was waged an endless contest between nature and our views of what a garden should be. Of the joys of this noble order of tillage I have written elsewhere, and I may not penetrate now into that mysterious world beyond the shrubbery, where plants assume the proportions of mammoth trees, and beds of mustard and cress took the imaginative eye of youth as boundless prairies. But if the conventional aims of grown-up gardening set limits to our fancy, if their ideal of beauty in the garden, unfriendly as it was to cricket and the fiercer outbreaks of Indians, was none of ours, we found nevertheless certain details in the process by which they sought to attain their illusory ends stimulating and wholly delightful. Flowers might inspire in us no more than a rare and short-lived curiosity, but the watering pot, and even better the garden hose, were our very good friends. Tidiness was no merit in the garden of our dreams, but our song of joy rose straight to heaven with the smoke of bonfires. Meadows were more to our taste than the prim culture of lawns, but in our hands the lawn-mower became a flaming chariot, and we who drove it as unscorched phaetons praised for the zest with which we pursued our pleasure by all Olympus. It was one of the charms of childhood that such praise would sometimes fall from the lips of our rulers as suddenly and as mysteriously as their censure. It was pleasant, after a gorgeous afternoon spent in extinguishing imaginary conflagrations with the garden hose, to be congratulated on the industry with which we had watered the flowers. It was pleasant to be rewarded with chocolates from France for burning witches on the rubbish heap behind the greenhouse. As a matter of fact, we never helped the gardener unless it suited us, and we would have hidden in the shrubbery a whole day rather than be entrapped into half an hour's weeding, an occupation which we regarded in the light of a severe punishment. And the odd confusion in the grown-up mind between right and wrong never ceased to intrigue us. When my elder brother, in a sentimental hour, flung a wreath of roses on to the stately head of the aunt of the moment, we knew that it was a pretty thought, very happily translated into action. But the Olympians treated it as a crime. Yet it was not his fault that the thorns tore her hair. Had there been any thornless roses, he probably would have used them. And, being honest, we wondered no less when we were praised for playing with the garden hose, that coiled about our legs like wet snakes and made our stockings wet on the warmest summer day, for in our hearts we knew that into any occupation so pleasant must surely enter the elements of crime. But the rulers of our destiny would bid us change our wet clothes with a calm brow, and would congratulate each other on our interest in the garden. We lived in a strange world. The judgments of the gardener we could better understand, though, alas, we had to sum him up as unreliable. He was a twisted little man who had been to sea in his youth, and we knew that he had been a pirate because he had a red face, an enormous clasp knife, and knew how to make every imaginable kind of knot. Moreover, there was a small barrel in the tool house that had manifestly held gunpowder once upon a time. Such evidence as this was not to be refuted, but we had to conclude that he had been driven from the high seas in disgrace, for he was pitifully lacking in the right pirate spirit. No pirate, we felt, would have taken the tale of our petty misdeeds to the Olympian courts for settlement, yet this is what Esau did under cover of a duplicity that aggravated the offense. In one and the same hour he would expound to us the intricacies of the Chinese knot with many friendly and sensible observations, and tell the shocked Olympians that we had thrown his rose sticks all over the garden in the manner of javelins. Captain Shark of the bark Rapacious would not have acted like this if it was conceivable that the sinister hero could have turned gardener. Perhaps he would have smitten us sorely with the Dutch hoe, or scalped us with his pruning knife by means of a neat twist learned in Western America. But whatever form his revenge might have assumed, he would have scorned to betray us to the people who had forgotten how to play. Esau was a sad knave. And unlike the Olympians, he had no illusions as to the value of our labors in the garden, treating our generous assistance with the scantiest gratitude and crediting our enthusiasm with the greater part of nature's shortcomings. Whenever our horticultural efforts became at all spirited, he would start up suddenly from behind a hedge, and admonish us as the boy in Prunella admonishes the birds. He would not allow us to irrigate the flower beds by means of a system of canals. He checked, or at least attempted to check, our consumption of fruit, deliciously unripe. Has anyone noticed that an unripe greengage eaten fresh from the tree is a gladder thing than any ripe fruit? He would not let us play at executions with the scythe, or at avalanches with the garden roller. The man's soul was a cabbage, and I fear that he regarded us as a tiresome kind of vermin that he might not destroy. Nevertheless, as the Olympians liked to see us employed in the garden, he could not wholly refuse our proffered aid, and he would watch our adventures with the garden hose and the lawn-mower, with his piratical features incarnadined, as it were, by the light of his lurid past. Naturally, water being a good friend of children, to water the garden was the most popular task of all, and as I was the youngest brother, it was but rarely that I was privileged to experience that rare delight. To feel the cool rush of the water through fingers hot with play, and the comfortable trickle down one's sleeve to smite a plant with muddy destruction, and to hear the cheerful sound made by the torrent in falling on to the soaked lawn, these and their fellow emotions may not be those of adult gardeners, but they are not to be despised. But as I have said, they were not for me, and usually I had to be content with mowing the lawn, an occupation from which I drew a full measure of placid enjoyment. Age dims our realization of the emotional significance of our own actions, and it is only by an effort of memory that I can arrive at the philosophy of the contented mower of lawns. I suppose that professional gardeners find the labor monotonous, lacking both the artistic interest of such work as pruning and the scientific subtleties of cucumber growing. But youth has the precious faculty of finding the extraordinary in the commonplace, and I had only to drag the lawn-mower from its rugged bed among the forks and spades in the tool-house to embark on a sea of intricate and diverse adventure. The very appearance of the thing was cheery and companionable, with its hands outstretched to welcome mine and its coat of green more vivid than any lawn. To seize hold of its smooth handles was like shaking hands with an old friend, and as it rattled over the gravel path it chattered to me in the gruff tones of a genial uncle. Once on the smooth lawn its voice thrilled to song, tremulous and appealing, and filled with the throbbing of great wings. Even now I know no sound that cries of the summer so poignantly as the intermittent song of the lawn-mower heard far off through sunny gardens. And cheered by that song I might drive my chariot, or it might be my plough, where I would. Not for me the stiff brocaded pattern beloved of Esau. I made curves, skirting the shadows of the tall poplars, or cutting the lawn into islands and lagoons. Over the grass box, or the nose bag as we called it, the grass danced like a mist of green flies, and I beheaded the daisies with the zest of a Caligula, pausing sometimes to marvel at those modest blossoms that survived my passage. I marveled, too, with the cold inhumanity of youth at the injudicious earthworms that tried to stay my progress, and perished for their pains. Sometimes a stray pebble would grate unpleasantly on the blades, and waken my lulled senses with a jerk. Sometimes I would drive too close to a flower bed, and munched fragments of pansies and wallflowers would glow amongst the grass in the grass box. No doubt a part of my enjoyment lay in the feeding of that natural spirit of destructiveness that present-day Olympians satisfy with frequent gifts of clockwork toys, ingenious mechanisms very proper to be inquired into by young fingers. But there was more in it than that. I liked the smell of the newly cut grass, and I would run my fingers through it and press damp, warm handfuls of it to my face to win the full savor of it. I even liked the more pungent odor of the grass heap where last week's grass lay drying in the sun. And the effort necessary to drive the worker of wonders across the lawn gave me a pleasant sense of my own sturdiness. But the fact remains that, with all these reasons, I cannot wholly fathom the true philosophy of lawn mowing with my adult mind. I have set down all the joys that I remember, but some significant fact, some essential note of enchantment is missing. What did I think about as I pressed to and fro with my lawn-mower? Sometimes, perhaps, I was a ploughman, guiding vast horses along the crests of mountains, and pausing now and again to examine the treasures that my labor had revealed in the earth, leather bags of guineas and jeweled crowns that sparkled through their mask of clay. Sometimes I might be a charioteer, driving a team of mad horses round the circus for Nero's pleasure, or a fireman driving a fire engine scatheless through bewildered streets. But withal I believe that sometimes I was no more than a little boy, mowing the lawn of a sunny garden, loving the task for its own sake, and inspired by no subtler spirit than that which led Esau to cultivate cabbages with dogged enthusiasm. It would not do to condemn that dishonored pirate because he saw heaven as a kitchen garden, and regarded flowers as the fond toys of the Olympian dotage. He too had his illusions. He too, while he sowed the seed, had visions of an impossible harvest. His ultimate fate eludes my memory, but doubtless he is finished with his husbandry by now. I, too, no longer mow the lawn, save when arrayed in fantastic knickerbockers and dream-shod as of yore. I trim the grass plats of sleep with a lawn-mower that sings as birds no longer sing. What the purpose of my youthful labors may have been I do not know. Parturient montes, nesciler, ridiculus mus. Perhaps I was already enrolled in the employment agency of destiny as a writer of idle articles. End of section 17. Recording by Philip Gould.
Section 18 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wolfgang Bass. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Children and the Sea. The sea, like all very large things, can only be intimately understood by children. If we can conceive a sensible grown-up person looking at the sea for the first time, we feel that he should either yawn or wish to drown himself. But a child would take a sample of it in a bucket, and consider that in all its aspects, and then it would know that the sea is a great many bucketfuls of water, and further, that by an odd freak of destiny, this water is not fit to drink. Storms and ships and sand castles and lighthouses and all other sideshows would follow later, but in the meantime the child would have seen the sea in a bucket, and it had previously seen the moon in a looking-glass, so would know all about it. The moon is a variable and interesting kind of lamp. The sea is the buckets and buckets and buckets full of water. I think the stars are holes in a sort of a black curtain or ceiling, and the sun is a piece of brightness, except at sunset, or in a mist when it's a whole Dutch cheese. The world is streets and fields and the seaside and our house. I doubt whether a child has any sense of what I may call the appeal of breath. If it is confronted with a fine view, it will concentrate its interest on a windmill or a doll's house, and the seaside is no more than a place where one wears no shoes or stockings, and the manufacture of mud pies becomes suddenly licit. The child does not share the torments of the adult Londoner who feels that there is no room in the world to stretch his arms or legs, and therefore wins a pathetic sense of freedom in seeing the lone yellow sands and the green waste of the sea. Nor is it at all excited by the consideration that there is a lot more sea beyond the horizon. The extent of its interest in the water is the limit to which it may paddle. Yet in some dim, strange way, the child realizes aesthetic values more here than elsewhere. I am quite sure it can see no real beauty in its normal surroundings. Sunsets and small houses lit for evening, the shining streets after rain, and even flowers and pictures and dolls are never beautiful to a child in the sense that a story or an idea may be beautiful. But tacitly, for a child has no language to express such things, something of the blueness of the sea seems to seek expression in its eyes. Something of the sparkle of the sand seems to be tangled in its hair. Something of the sunshine burns in its rounded calves that glow like brown eggs. A child is always a thing of wonder. But on the edge of the sea this wonder deepens until the artificial observer is abashed. A seaside child is no creature to be patted and laughed over. It were as easy to pat the tireless waters and to laugh over the grave of a little cat. Children whom one has known very well indeed in town will find new playing fields by the sea into which it is impossible to follow them. Dorothy weighs 5 stone 4 pounds at Maida Vale. At Littlehampton, the sea wind blows her along like a feather. She is become a wispy spiritual thing, a faint, fair creature, a dance on light feet that would make the fairy girl of a poet's dream seem clumsy by comparison. She is nearer to us when she paddles. The warm sand creeping up through her toes, the silver thread of a coolness about her legs, these things are within our comprehension, though they fall no more within our experience. But when she flings herself along the beach with the wild hair and loose limbs, and the thong of an innocent beckonet, when she bids the gold sands heave up and support her body, tired with play, when she stoops to gather diamonds and pearls from the shore, made wet and smooth by the retreating waves, she is as far from us and our human qualities as a new awakened butterfly. There have been sea-washed moments when I should not have been astonished if she had flung out a pair of mother-of-pearl wings and stood in the blue sky like a child saint in a stained-glass window. There have been other moments when she has approached me with a number of impossible questions in wanton parody of her simple London self. Between these two extremes her moods vary from second to second, and she plays upon them as Pan upon his pipes, and to much the same tune. She loves the long tresses of seaweed and the pink shells, like the nails of her own little hands, and her colored pale, when she is not the architect of sea-girt palaces, is a treasury of salty wonders. To climb the rough rocks and call them mountains, to drive back the waves with the chiding foot, and to alter the face of nature with a wooden spade, these were not tasks for the domesticated creature who shares the hearth-rug with the cat at home. But the spirit of the sea has changed Dorothy. She is now a little more and a little less than child, and she recognizes no comrades but those other nymphs of the sea who hold the beach with the sparkle of wet feet and careless petticoats, who run hither and thither in search of a big adventure, while their parents and guardians sleep in the sun. It is hard that age should deprive us of so many privileges, and least of all can we spare the glamour of the sands of the sea. Yet to the adult mind, Brighton Beach, sprinkled with newspapers and washed by a sea whose surface is black with smuts, brings little but disgust. We insist on having our fairyland clean, and end too often by finding no fairyland at all. The sea, after all, is no more than water that may be caught in a bucket. The sand may glitter on a child's spade, and we who believe that the essential knowledge of the thing is ours are no wiser than the children. For me, the sea is a restless and immeasurable waste of greens and blues and greys, and I know that its strength lies in its monotony. It is not the noisy turbulence of storms that moves me to fear, but the dull precision of the tides and the tireless succession of waves. And my impression is no truer than the children's, and lends itself less readily to a sympathetic manner of living. I feel that if I could once more hold the ocean in my bucket, if the whole earth might be uprooted by my spade, I should be nearer to a sense of the value of life than I am now. I see the children go trooping by with their calm eyes, not, as is sometimes said, curious, but rather tolerant of life. And I know that for them the universe is merely an aggregate of details, some agreeable and some stupid, while I must needs depress myself by regarding it as a whole. And this is the proven distinction between juvenile and adult philosophies, if we may be permitted to regard a child's very definite point of view as the effect of a philosophy. Life is a collection of little bits of experience. The seaside bits are pleasant, and there is nothing more to be said. End of section 18.
Section 19 of the day before yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Miheva. The day before yesterday, by Richard Middleton. On going to bed. When the winter fires were burning their merriest in the grates, or when the summer sun was melting to crimson shadows down in the western fields, we, pressing our noses on the window panes in placable discussion of the day's cricket, or dreaming our quiet dreams on the playroom floor, would hear a heart-breaking pronouncement fall tonelessly from the lips of the Olympians. "Come, children, it's time you were in bed." It needed no more than that to bring our hearts to zero with a run, and set our lips quivering in eloquent but supremely useless protest. Against this decree there was, we knew, no appeal, and we pleaded our hopeless cause rather from habit than from any expectation of success. And even while we uttered passionate expressions of our individual wakefulness, and vowed our impatience for the coming of that golden age when we should be allowed to sit up all night, we were collecting the honoured toys that shared our beds in mournful recognition of the inevitable. It wasn't that we had any great objection to bed in itself, but that fate always decreed that bedtime should fall in the brightest hour of the day. No matter what internecine conflicts, whether with the Olympians or each other, had rendered the day miserable, when bedtime drew near, the air was sweet with the spirit of universal brotherhood, as though in face of our common danger we wished to propitiate the gods by means of our unwonted merit. Feuds were patched up, confiscated property was restored to its rightful owner, and brother hailed brother with a smiling countenance and that genial kind of rudeness that passed with us for politeness. This was the time of day, too, when the more interesting kind of Olympian would make his appearance. Uncles, at least we called them uncles, who could perform conjuring tricks and tell exciting stories, and aunts who kissed us, but had a compensating virtue in that they had been known to produce unexpected sweets. The house that might have been a gloomy prison of dullness during the long day became, by sudden magic, entertaining and happily alive. The kitchen was fragrant with the interesting odours that come from the cooking of strange adult viands. The passages were full of strong men who could lift small boys to the ceiling without an effort, and who would sometimes fling sixpences about with prodigal lavishness. The whole place was gay with parcels to be opened and lively, if incomprehensible, conversation. And ever while we were thrilling to find that our normal environment could prove so amusing, the Olympians would realize our existence in their remote eyries of thought, and would send us stricken with barren germs of revolt to our uneventful beds. On me, as the youngest of the brothers, the nightly shock should have fallen lightly, for I was but newly emancipated from the shameful ordeal of going to bed for an hour in the afternoon, and I could very well remember, though I pretended I had forgotten, the sensations of that drowsy hour when the birds sang so loudly outside the window and the sun thrust fingers of dusty gold through the crannies of the blind. I should therefore probably have been reconciled to the common lot, which spelt advancement to me, had I not newly discovered the joy of dreaming those dreams that men have written in books for the delight of the young. The Olympians were funny about books. They gave them to us, or at the least smiled graciously when other people gave them to us, but the moment rarely arrived when they could endure to see us reading, or spoiling our eyes, as their dreadful phrase ran, and especially at nightfall, when the shadows crept in from the corners of the room and made the pages of the dullest book exciting. It was inviting an early bedtime to be detected in the act of reading. As sure as the frog was about to turn into a prince, or the black enchantress had appeared with her embarrassing christening present, the book would be taken from my hands, and I would be threatened with the compulsory wearing of old maidish spectacles, an end that would make me an object of derision in the eyes of men. And even if I shut the book of my own accord, and sat nodding before the fire, working out the story in my own fashion, with someone I knew very well to play the part of hero, some ruthless adult would accuse me of being half asleep already, and the veil of illusion would be torn beyond repair. In winter time the bedroom would seem cold after the comfortable kingdom of the hearthrug, and the smell of scented soap was a poor substitute for the friendly fragrance of burning logs. So we would undress as quickly as possible and lie cuddled up in the chilly bedclothes, holding our own cold feet in our hands as if they belonged to somebody else. But if it happened that one of us had a bad cold, and there was a fire in the bedroom, we would keep high festival, sitting in solemn palaver round the campfire and toasting our pink toes like Arctic explorers, while the invalid lay in bed crowing over his black currant tea or hot lemonade. It was pleasant, too, when natural weariness had driven us to our beds, to lie there and watch the firelight laughing on the walls, and the invalid, for the time being, was rather a popular person. In summer-time, getting into bed was a far more complex process, for the youth of the night held us wakeful, and if the weather were warm, bed was an undesirable place, as soon as we had exhausted such coolness as lingered in the sheets. Then we would devote ourselves to pillow fighting, which was, I think, a more humorous sport for elder brothers than for younger, or we would express our firm intention of sleeping all night on the floor under tents made of the bedclothes. The best of this resolution was that it made bed seem so comfortable when we climbed back after the first fine romance of camping out had worn off. Thunderstorms we loved with a love not touched by awe, and we would huddle together at the window, measuring the lightning, appraising the thunder, and listening to the cold thresh of the rain on the garden below. There were rare nights, nights of great winds, when we would suddenly realize that fear had entered into the room, and that after all we were children in a world of men. Our efforts to talk resulted in tremulous whispers that bred fear rather than allayed it, and though we wouldn't even then admit it, we knew that we were possessed with a great loneliness. Sooner or later some cunning spirit would suggest a pilgrimage to the realms of the Olympians, and treading the warm stair-carpet with our bare feet, we would journey till we heard the comforting sound of their laughter and the even murmur of their conversation. Sometimes we would stay there till we grew sleepy, and the fear passed away, so that we could tiptoe back to bed, wondering a little at ourselves. Sometimes the Olympians would discover us, and comfort our timid hearts with rough words and sweet biscuits. In the morning we would pretend that the whole business had been only an adventure, and we were not above bragging of our courage and daring the eye of the grown-up people, but we knew better. End of section 19.
Section 20 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Street Organs. It is very true, as Mr. Chesterton must have remarked somewhere, that the cult of simplicity is one of the most complex inventions of civilization. To eat nuts in a meadow when you can eat a beefsteak in a restaurant is neither simple nor primitive. It is merely perverse, in the same way that the art of Gauguin is perverse. A shepherd boy piping to his flock in Arcady, and a poet playing the penny whistle in a Soho garret, may make the same kind of noise. But whereas the shepherd boy knows no better, the poet has to pretend that he knows no better. So I reject scornfully the support of those amateurs who profess to like street organs because they are the direct descendants of the itinerant ballad singers of the romantic past, or because they represent the simple musical tastes of the majority today. I refuse to believe that in appreciating the sound of the complex modern instruments dragged across London by Cockneys disguised as Italians, the soul of the primitive man who lurks in some dim oubliette of everybody's consciousness is in any way comforted. I should imagine that poor prisoner, if civilization's cruelty has not deprived him of the faculty of hearing, is best pleased by such barbaric music as the howling of the wind or the sound of railway engines suffering in the night. And indeed every one must have noticed that sometimes certain sounds, unmusical in themselves, can arouse the same emotions as the greatest music. But it is not on this score that street organs escape our condemnation. Their music has certain defects that even distance cannot diminish, and they invariably give us the impression of a man speaking through his nose in a high-pitched voice, without ever pausing to take breath. If, in spite of this, we have a kindness for them, it is because of their association with the gladdest moments of childhood. To the adult ear they bring only desolation and distraction, but to the children, the organ man, with his curly black hair and his glittering earrings, seems to be trailing clouds of glory. For them, the barrel organ combines the merits of Wagner, Beethoven, Strauss and Debussy, and Orpheus would have to imitate its eloquent strains on his lute if he wished to captivate the hearts of London children. When I was a child, the piano organ, and that terrible variant that reproduces the characteristic stutter of the mandolin with deadly fidelity, were hardly dreamed of. But the ordinary barrel organ, and the prehistoric hurdy-gurdy, whose quavering notes suggested senile decay, satisfied our natural craving for melody. It is true that they did not make so much noise as the modern instruments, but in revenge they were almost invariably accompanied by a monkey in a little red coat or a performing bear. I always had a secret desire to turn the handle of the organ myself, and when, too late in life to enjoy the full savour of the feat, I persuaded a wandering musician to let me make the experiment, I was surprised to find that it is not so easy as it looks to turn the handle without jerking it, and that the arm of the amateur is weary long before the repertoire of the organ is exhausted. It is told of Mascagni that he once taught an organ man how to play his notorious intermezzo to the fullest effect, but I fancy that in professional circles the story would be discredited, for the arm of the practised musician acquires by force of habit a uniform rate of revolution, and in endeavouring to modify that rate he would lose all control over his instrument. Personally, I do not like hearing excerpts from Italian opera on the street organs, because that is not the kind of music that children can dance to, and it is, after all, in supplying an orchestra for the ballroom of the street that they best justify their existence. The spectacle of little ragged children dancing to the music of the organ is the prettiest and merriest and saddest thing in the world. In France and Belgium they waltz. In England they have invented a curious compound of the reel, the gavotte, and the cakewalk. The best dancers in London are always little Jewesses, and it is worth anybody's while to go to Whitechapel at midday to see Miriam dancing on the cobbles of Stony Lane. There is not, as I once thought, a thwarted enchanter shut up inside street organs, who cries out when the handle turns in the small of his back. But why is it that I feel instinctively that magicians have drooping moustaches and insinuating smiles, if it is not that my mind as a child founded its conception of magicians on itinerant musicians? And they weave powerful spells, strong enough to make these poor little atomies forget their birthright of want and foot it like princesses. Children approach their amusements with a gravity beside which the work of a man's life seems deplorably flippant. A baby toddling round a bandstand is a far more impressive sight than a grown man circumnavigating the world, and children do not smile when they dance. All the laughter is in their feet. When, from time to time, brain workers write to the newspapers to suggest that street musicians should be suppressed, I feel that the hour has almost come to start a movement in favour of votes for children. It is disgraceful, ladies and gentlemen, that this important section of the community, on whom the whole future of the nation depends, should have no voice in the forming of the nation's laws. This question of street organs cannot be solved by banishing them to the slums without depriving many children of a legitimate pleasure. For, sub rosa, the children of Park Lane, if there are any children in Park Lane, and even the children of brain workers, appreciate the music of street organs quite as much as their humble contemporaries. While father buries his head under the sofa cushions and composes furious letters to the Times in that stuffy hermitage, little noses are pressed against the window pane, little hands applaud, and little feet beat time on the nursery floor upstairs. This is one of those situations where it is permissible to sympathise with all parties, and unless father can achieve an almost inhuman spirit of tolerance, I see no satisfactory solution. For children must have music. They must have tunes to think to and laugh to and live to. Funeral marches to the grave are all very well for the elderly and disillusioned, but youth must tread a more lively measure. And this music should come like the sunshine in winter, surprisingly, at no fixed hour, as though it were a natural consequence of life. One of the gladdest things about the organ man in our childhood was the unexpectedness of his coming. Life would be dragging a little in schoolroom circles, when suddenly we would hear the organ clearing its throat, as it were. We would all run to the window to wave our hands to the smiling musician, and shout affectionate messages to his intelligent monkey, who caught our pennies in his little pointed cap. In those days we had all made up our minds that when we grew up we would have an organ and a monkey of our own. I think it is rather a pity that with age we forget these lofty resolutions of our childhood. I have formed a conception of the ideal street organist that would only be fulfilled by someone who had realised the romance of that calling in their youth. How often, when the children have been happiest and the dance has been at its gayest, I have seen the organ man fold music's wings and move on to another pitch in search of pennies. I should like to think that it is a revolt against this degraded commercialism that inspires the protests of the critics of street music. The itinerant musician, who believed in art for art's sake, would never move on so long as he had an appreciative audience. And sometimes, though I am afraid this would be the last straw to the brain workers, he would arrive at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the children, roused from their sleep, would hear Pan piping to his moonlit flocks, and would believe that they were still in the pleasant country of dreams. End of section 20.
Section 21 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roman Noble, RomanNoble.com. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Secret Society. Now that the Houndsditch affair has been laid aside by the man in the street, and it is once more possible for a bearded Englishman to tread the pavements of London without reproach, I may perhaps venture to give some account of a secret society with which I have been intimately connected, without earning the reputation of a monger of sensations. Some 4 or 5 years ago, I met a picturesque journalist who told me that he had once been at pains to worm out the secrets of an anarchist society in London, and had incorporated his discoveries in a volume so marvelous that no editor or publisher would believe it. I only remember one incident of all his wonderful adventures. He was led by an anarchist comrade into a small shop in the Strand, thence into a cellar, and thence along a series of passages and caverns that ultimately brought him out into the 7 Dials. Even Mr. Chesterton's Detective Anarchist in The Man Who Was Thursday could not beat this. For my part, I shall not try, but shall content myself with the straightforward narration of facts. I should think it was about last July that I first noticed that the children of my neighborhood, with whom I have some small acquaintance, were endeavoring to assume a sinister aspect, and were wearing a cryptic button with a marked air of secrecy. When I came out for my morning walk, the front garden would be animated with the partially concealed children, like the park in Mr. Kipling's They. And though I have long realized that suburban front gardens do not lend themselves to the higher horticulture, I felt the natural embarrassment of the man who does not know whether he is expected to expel trespassers or welcome bashful visitors. In the circumstances, I affected not to notice that the lilac was murmurous with ill-suppressed laughter and that the laurels were waving tumultuously. But it was hardly reassuring to discover on my return that a large red cross and the letters T.S. had been chalked on my gate by an unknown hand. For a moment I wondered whether the children had been reading Sentimental Tommy, for these were the initials and the methods of Mr. Barry's luckless hero. But the age and genial contempt for scholarship of the investing forces made this unlikely. On the 4th day, finding one of the band momentarily separated from her comrades, I ventured a coup d'etat. Pointing to the letters of her secret button, I remarked, "I see you belong to the Teapot Society." "I don't," she said indignantly. "It's the Terror Society I belong to." The secret was out, but I thought it wiser to conceal my triumph. Evidently, however, my discovery troubled the band, for next morning I received a soi-disant anonymous letter of caution signed in full by all the members. I felt that the moment had arrived for definite action, especially as the cat who honors my house with his presence, and whose summer morning basking place is in the front garden, had been much upset by this recurrent invasion of his privacy. I wrote a humble letter to the society, apologizing for my crimes and begging that I might be allowed to become a member, and placed it outside on the path. 5 minutes later, 2 very unembarrassed children appeared in my study and introduced themselves as captain and secretary of the Terror Society. The captain was very frank with me. "Of course we didn't really want to frighten you," she said, "but we had to get you to become a member somehow or other." "But I'm afraid I'm not much good at conspiracies," I said modestly. "Oh, that doesn't matter," the captain answered kindly. "You can be honorable treasurer. You know, we want a lot of things for our house." I began to see what part I had in the scheme of things. "What are the rules of the society?" I asked in all innocence, and thereby flung the secretary into confusion. "You see, she wrote them out," the captain explained, "and she doesn't want to read them because of the spelling. But they're only made-up rules, so you needn't bother about them. Do you want to see the house?" "Captain," I said firmly, "it is my one wish. Lead on." "You really ought to be blindfolded," the captain whispered to me as we went along. "But I used my handkerchief to wrap up some of Cook's toffee this morning, and it's rather sticky." "Don't apologize," I murmured hastily. "I don't mind not being blindfolded a bit. Besides, I'm practically a member, and you mustn't blindfold members. It isn't done." The captain seemed relieved. "I knew you would make a good treasurer," she said with cheerful inconsequence. "But look, there's the house." The headquarters or clubhouse of the Terror Society stood beside the allotment gardens at the top of the hill, and may, at some less honorable period of its history, have served as a place for storing tools. In the course of their trespassings, the children had found it lying empty, and had obtained permission from the landlord to have it for their very own. I have implied that the feminine element was predominant in the society, and, recalling the wigwams and log huts of my own childhood, the difference between the ideals of boys and girls was sharply brought home to me when I crossed the threshold. The walls were papered with sentimental pictures out of Christmas numbers and literally draped with curtains. There were vases filled with flowers in every corner, and in the middle of this boudoir 3 of the members were drinking tea. In a sense, perhaps, the girls were to be commended for finding the true romance in domesticity. But I could not help wondering what Captain Shark of the Bark Rapacious, that faithful friend of my boyhood, would have thought of a terror society run on such principles. However, I saw that the eyes of the members were upon me, and I hastened to do my duty as an honorable member. "It's wonderful," I said. "How on earth did you manage to do it all yourselves?" The children all fell to apportioning the credit all, that is, save the captain, who seemed to me a very businesslike fellow. "You see, Mr. Treasurer," she said, "we want some more of those camp stools and a lock to keep out burglars, and some knives and forks, and a tin of biscuits, and a pail, and candles, and a candlestick, and a clothes brush, and a little bell to ring at dinner time, and a knocker for the door." Fortunately, she paused to take a breath. "My dear Captain," I interrupted quickly, "I have a sovereign in the savings bank, and if you come with me tomorrow, we'll draw it out, and do the best we can with the money. But tell me, am I really a member?" "Of course you are." "Then where's my mysterious button?" The captain frowned. "Jessie will have to paint you one, but the ribbon cost a penny." "That makes 20 shillings and a penny," said the secretary. It was indeed a businesslike society. The next day, the captain and I did a lot of miscellaneous shopping, and 2 days later the button was left at my door by a small boy. Then for a fortnight I heard nothing of the society or its members, and no sinister invasion of the morning occurred to disturb the far peace in the eyes of my cat. At last I met the captain in the road, and though she endeavored to elude me, I succeeded in getting her into a corner. "Well, Captain," I said, "how's the Terror Society?" The captain looked gloomy. "Haven't you heard?" she said. "The Terror Society is all over." "Finished already?" I cried in astonishment. What have you done with the house?" "It has been given to another society," she said without a blush. "Another society?" "Yes, the Horror Society. I am captain." I considered this news for a moment. "Well, I suppose I'm a member of the new society?" I ventured. The captain shook her head sadly. "I'm so sorry," she said, "but the HS has a rule that no grown-ups are admitted. That is why, though I myself was a member of the Terror Society, I yet feel myself at liberty to write about it. For as on inquiry I discovered that the ranks of the Horror Society differed in no wise from those of the Terror Society, save for the exclusion of the honorable treasurer, I cannot help feeling that I have been rather badly treated. End of section 21.
Section 22 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Miheva. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. The Price of Peace. I cannot remember how old I was when I wrote the thrilling poem about the tiger who swallowed the horse, nor am I quite certain that it was my first literary effort, but I know that I was still at the tight knickerbocker stage, and that my previous poems, if there had been any, had remained secrets of my own. It was due to a cousin that my conspiracy against the world of common sense was finally discovered. Woman-like, she tickled my ears with flattery and persuaded me to let her read the precious document. And then, as soon as she had it in her hand, she fled to the camp of the Olympians, leaving me alone in the little dark room to reflect on the guiles of the sex. With straining ears, I waited for the distant chorus of mocking laughter that would announce my failure, while my body tingled all over with shame. Yet, beneath my fear, I was conscious that I hadn't been wholly unwilling to be betrayed. It seemed to me that if I proved to be a great poet, my future traffic with the Olympians might be of a more agreeable character than it had been previously. On the other hand, I felt that life would be impossible if they greeted my poem with scorn. Conceived and perfected in solitude, it had become an intimate part of myself, and I turned dark thoughts to the purple berries that grew in the shrubbery and provided us with wholly innocuous poison for our arrows. Even then, it would seem, I had an instinctive knowledge of the tragedy of failing as a poet. And then, while I yet waited in suspense, I heard the sound of footsteps and knew that my cousin was returning. In a flash I realized how stupid I had been to remain in the room, when I might have hidden myself in some far corner of the attic and appeared no more until my shame had been forgotten. My legs trembled in sudden panic, and it seemed to me that my face was ticking like a clock. I received my first critic with my head buried in the cushions of the sofa. Looking back, I perceived that the Olympians rose to the occasion, but at the time I could hardly believe my good fortune. Long after my cousin had gone away, I lay on the sofa turning over the pleasant message in my mind and the magic half-crown in my hand. Praise I had desired, if not expected, but that the Olympians, whose function in life was to divert our tips into a saving bank account that meant nothing to us, that these stern financiers should give me a whole half-crown in one sum, unhindered by any restrictions in the spending, was incredible. Yet I could feel its rough edge in the dark, and considering its source, I formed an erroneous idea of the influence of the arts on the minds of sane, grown-up people, from which even now I am not wholly delivered. After a while, with a mind strangely confused between pride and modesty, I stole into the room where the others were sitting. But with a quick sense of disappointment, I saw that I needn't have concerned myself at all with the proper attitude for a young poet to adopt. The Olympians, engaged in one of their meaningless discussions, didn't notice my entrance, and only my brothers were interested when I crept silently into their midst. "What are you going to spend it on?" they whispered. Oddly, for I was the youngest of four, this success of mine was responsible for a literary outburst in our normally uncultured schoolroom, and one of the fruits of that intellectual disturbance, in the shape of a manuscript magazine, lies before me. It contains an editorial address to the friendly reader, 2 short stories full of murders, a quantity of didactic verse, and the first instalment of a serial which commences gravely: "My father was a bootmaker of considerable richness." Of literary achievement, or even promise, it would be hard to find a trace in these yellowing pages, but there is an enthusiasm behind every line of them that the critic would seek in vain in modern journalism. Indeed, those were the days in which to write, when paper and pencil and half an hour never failed to produce a masterpiece, and the finished work invariably thrilled the artist with outlandish pride. I cannot recall that any further half-crowns rewarded our efforts, and possibly that is the reason why 3 of the 4 boys who wrote that magazine are now regenerate and write no more. And even the 4th must own to having lost that fine, careless trick of throwing off masterpieces, and to regretting in moments of depression the generous Olympian impulse that enabled him to barter his birthright of common sense for a silver coin with a rough edge. And the Olympians, they too have regretted it, I suppose, for the goddess of letters is an exacting mistress, and we do not willingly see our children engaging in her irregular service. Yet I do not see what else they could have done at the time. A little while ago I discovered a small girl to whom I act as a kind of illegal uncle in the throes of lyrical composition. With soft words and flattering phrases, borrowed perhaps from the cousin of the past, I won the paper from her grasp. It was like all the poetry that children have ever written, and I was preparing to banter the young author when I saw that she was regarding me with curious intentness, and that her face turned red and white by turns. Even if my intentions had been honourable, I couldn't have disregarded her signs of distress. "I think it's very nice indeed," I said. "I'll give you half a crown for it." As her fingers closed on the coin, I felt inclined to raise a shout of triumph, for now that I have paid the half-crown back, I should be gradually, for of course the habit of years isn't broken in a minute, to stop writing. My only fear is that my conscience may have gone to sleep in my long years of aloofness from simplicity. For though I already detect a note of vagueness in the eyes of my niece, and her mother complains that she is becoming untidy, I hold my peace and offer no explanation, for I feel sure that if I did, I should recover my half-crown. End of section 22.
Section 23 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. On Children's Gardens. In the well-ordered garden of every well-ordered house, that is, every house that numbers children in its treasury, there lies, screened perhaps by some inconvenient shrubbery, but none the less patent to the stars and the winds and the polite visitor, a tormented patch of earth, where sway in dubious security of tenure a number of sickly plants. For days they have lain parched and neglected in the summer sun. For days they have been beaten down into a morass by torrents poured from an excited watering pot. Their roots have regarded heaven for no less a period than their heads. And in the face of such unnatural conditions, Ceres, one fancies, must have fallen back in confusion and left them to struggle on as best they can unaided. It is only the most hardy of plants that may survive the attentions of a youthful gardener, and it is a tribute to nature's obstinacy that any survive at all. I have in my mind a garden of this kind, and thereby hangs one of those rather tragic stories which grown-up people are apt to consider funny. The garden lay below an old brick wall, which must, I think, have faced south, for, as I remember it, it was always lit by the sun. It was the property of 3 children, and their separate estates were carefully marked off by decorative walls of shells and freakish pebbles. Here, early and late, 2 of the children waged a gallant war against nature, thwarting and checking her with 100 delicate attentions. But on the 3rd had fallen that pleasant mood when it is nicer to lie in the shade and to dream of wine than to labor in the vineyard. His garden was a tangle of weeds and of healthy neglected plants, and when the inevitable awakening came, he saw that it would require days of unprofitable work to turn the wilderness into a proper garden. Yet to hear the uninformed comparisons of visitors was a shameful ordeal not to be borne. He solved the problem, I still think, in a very spirited manner. He cleared the garden by the simple process of removing plants and weeds alike, and sowed the ground with seeds, purchased, alas, with a shilling extracted quite illegally from his money-box. But the secrecy of these movements had not escaped the notice of the Olympians, and later there fell on his horrified ears an entirely new and obviously truthful theory of botany. It seemed that the word thief could be plainly deciphered on the flowers of dishonest gardeners. There were no blossoms in that little boy's garden that year. Like the monk in Browning's poem, he pinched off all the buds before the sun was up. They were simple flowers we sought to cultivate in those days, simple flowers with beautiful names. Violets and snowdrops, the reticent but cheerful pansy, otherwise known as 3 faces under a hood, lovelies bleeding, wallflowers, stocks, and London pride, or none so pretty. Of these and their unaffected comrades we made our gardens. Spades and pickaxes were denied us, but the simple gardening tools were ours, and he has lived in darkness who has not experienced the keen joy of smacking the earth with the convex side of a trowel. My hands tingle when I remember how sore weeding made the fingertips, and there is something in the last ecstatic chuckle of a watering pot as it runs dry that lingers in the ear. I am aware that there are persons of mature years who can find pleasure in the performance of simple garden tasks, but I am afraid that subconsciously it is the aesthetic aspect of flowers that attracts them, and that their gardening is only a means to an end. No such charge could be brought against our efforts. We cared little about flowers or results of any sort. We only wanted to garden, and it troubled us not at all that the labors of one day destroyed those of the day before. To dig a deep hole and to fill it with water when completed is, as far as I have observed, no part of the ordinary gardener's daily work, but it was our favorite effort, and a share in the construction of these ornamental waters was the greatest favor that we could grant to a friend. There were always captivating insects with numerous and casual legs to be discovered in the digging, and great stones that parted from the earth as reluctantly as nuggets. And when we had hollowed a cup in the earth, we would pour in the sea and set our hearts floating upon its surface in paper ships. The sides of the hole would crumble down into the water like real cliffs, and every little fall would send a real wave sparkling across the surface of the ocean. Then there were bays to be cut and canals, and soundings to be taken with pieces of knotted string weighted with stones. Water has been the friend of children ever since Moses floated in his little ark of rushes to the feet of Pharaoh's daughter. I question whether they know very much about this sort of gardening at Kew, a place which is, however, beloved of children for the sake of the excellent spiral staircases in the palm houses. But every sensible child has the art at its fingertips, and in the time that we take to reach Brighton in a fleet motor they will construct a brand new sea for themselves, a sea with harbours and islands and sunken reefs, a perfect sea of wonder and romance. If we are prepared to set aside our preconceived ideas as to what a garden ought to be, we must own that the children are not far wrong after all. A garden is only a world in miniature, with prairies of flowers and forests of roses and gravel paths for the wide dusty roads. When we plant flowers in our garden, it is as though we added new territories to our empire, new reds and blues and purples to our treasury of colors. And so when a child has wrought a fine morning's havoc in its little patch of ground, it has added, it may be, an ocean, it may be only a couple of stars to the kingdom of imagination which we may no longer see. It only needs a sunny hour or two, a trowel, and a pair of dirty hands to change a few square yards of earth into a world. And the child may be considered fortunate in being able to express itself perfectly in terms of dust. Our books and pictures cumber the earth, our palaces strike the skies, and yet it is our common tragedy that we have not found expression. While down the garden behind the lilac bushes at this very moment Milton may have developed Lycidas into a sticky marsh, and Shakespeare may have compressed Hamlet into a mud pie. The works of the children end, as they begin, in dust, but we cannot pretend that ours are more permanent. End of section 23.
Section 24 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roman Noble, RomanNoble.com. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton, a distinguished guest. I am willing to acknowledge that until lately, when I was privileged to entertain a cat under my roof for a fortnight, my knowledge of these noble beings was only academic. I had read what the poets have to say about them, Wordsworth and Swinburne, Cowper and Gray. I knew that cat was the only word in the English language that had a vocative, puss. I knew that Southey mourned that his kitten should never attain to cathood, that the Egyptians were very fond of cats, and that Lord Roberts is not. Then I had seen cats in the streets and admired the spirit with which a homeless cat with no visible means of subsistence would put shame into the heart of a well-fed terrier. Lying awake by night, I heard their barbaric song ringing like a challenge in the ears of civilization, and had wondered whether some unknown Strauss might not revolutionize the music of the future by aid of their passionate harmonies. But I had never moved in their society, and therefore I would not understand them. In those days I should probably have thought that the recent message of the Postmaster General to the press, to the effect that cats of the old General Post Office had been found comfortable homes, was trivial, and I remember with shame that I watched the malevolent antics of the caricature of a cat that appears in the Bluebird without indignation. I do not propose to give the events of the fortnight in detail, but rather to summarize them for the benefits of others who, like myself, may be called upon unexpectedly to entertain a feline guest. The name of my visitor was Kim, though I am told that most cats are called William Pitt, after the statesman. He was a short-haired tabby cat, some 18 months old, and a fine large fellow for his age. While he was with me, he usually wore a white waistcoat, and there was a white mark on his face, as if some milk had been spilt there when he was a kitten. His eyes were very large and of the color of stage sunlight, and they haunted me from the moment when I raised the lid of the hamper in which he arrived. They were always significant and always inscrutable, but I could not help staring into them in the hope of discovering their meaning. I think he knew they fascinated me, for he would keep them wide open and full of secrets for hours at a time. I had been informed that his name was Kim because he was the little friend of all the world, but at the first I found him reticent and of an independent disposition. I had always believed that cats purred when you stroked them, but when I stroked him he would endure it in silence for a minute and then retire to a corner of the room and make an elaborate and, under the circumstances, uncomplimentary toilet. In my experience I was afraid that he had taken a dislike to me, but one evening, after he had been with me 3 days, he climbed into my lap and went to sleep. My pipe was on the mantelpiece, and as Kim weighed over 12 pounds, my legs grew very cramped, but I knew better than to disturb him, and he slept very comfortably till 2 in the morning. He repeated this compliment on several occasions, but when I lifted him into my lap he always got off immediately, and made me feel that I had been ill-treating him. His choice of sleeping places was strange. If I was reading, he waited till I laid the book down on the table and then fell asleep on top of it. When I was writing, and he had grown weary of turning his head from side to side to follow the bird-like flight of the pen to the inkpot, he loved to settle himself down on the wet manuscript and blink drowsily at my embarrassment. Once when I ventured to lift him off, he sulked under the table all the afternoon, and I did not repeat the experiment. He seemed to be a very sensitive cat. Of course he was too old to play with me, but he had famous games by himself with corks and pieces of paper. Sooner or later he would drive these under one of the bookcases and would sit down and meow plaintively until I went and raked them out for him. Then he would get up and walk away as if such toys were beneath his dignity. The one fault I found in his character was this constant emphasis of an inferiority that I was quite willing to confess. A generous cat would have realized that I was trying to do my best, and would have pardoned my 100 errors of judgment. Kim never wearied of putting me in my place, and turned a scornful tail to my heartfelt apologies. When he was dozing in the evening on the hearth rug, he was very angry if anyone put coals on the fire, even though he had been warned beforehand of what was about to happen. He would look at me with an air of noble reproach and stalk away to the window, where, perched on the back of a window seat, he would stay for hours, patiently observant of the sounds and smells of the night. But it was at mealtimes that he made me realize most of the strength of his individuality. I had imagined that all cats were fond of milk, but Kim quickly disillusioned me, and it was as the result of a series of experiments that I discovered that he would only drink new milk raised to a certain temperature, and not then if he thought I was watching him. For the first 24 hours after he arrived he would eat nothing, though I tried to tempt him with chicken, sardines, and fillet of sole. Once or twice he gave a little plaintive meow, but for the most part he succeeded in giving me the impression of a brave heart enduring the pangs of a consuming hunger with noble fortitude. At the end of that period, when he had reduced me to despair, he relieved himself and me by stealing a haddock. After that the task of feeding him was comparatively easy. I would prepare him a dinner and pretend to eat it myself with great enjoyment. Then I would leave the room as if I had suddenly remembered an appointment. When I returned, the plate would be empty, that is, as empty as a cat's dignity will allow him to leave a plate, and a few delicate impressions of Kim's paws on the tablecloth would tell me that all was well. The irritating motive that underlay this graceless mannerism was clear to me. He would not be beholden to me for so much as a sardine, and he was willing to steal all his meals so long as he could remain independent. I think, too, that it amused him to undermine my moral character by making me deceitful. Incidentally, a cookery book for cats is badly needed. Unlike dogs, they are gourmets rather than gourmands, and their appetites seem to languish if they do not have a continual change of fare. They have subtle palates. Kim liked gorgonzola cheese and curried rabbit, but he would not eat chicken in any form. I found anchovy sauce very useful to make a meal savory that Kim had not thought palatable enough to steal, and the wise host will hold this condiment in reserve for such occasions. There is no relying on their likes or dislikes. They will eat something with avidity one day and reject it with infinite distaste at the next. On the whole, it was a busy fortnight, and it was not without a certain relief that I said farewell to my emotional guest and sent him back to his owner. Designedly, as I believe, he had succeeded in making me painfully self-conscious, so that I could not do anything without being led to feel that in some way I was sinning against the laws of hospitality. It was pleasant to realize that my life was once more my own, and that I was free from the critical inspection of those significant, inscrutable eyes. I have commented on the independence of his character. It would be unjust if I failed to mention the one exception. One night I was awakened by a soft paw, a paw innocent of all claws, patting me gently on the cheek, and in the dark I was aware of Kim sitting on my pillow. I supposed that he was lonely and put up my hand to stroke him. Then, for once in a way, the proudest of sentient beings was pleased to drop the mask of his pride and purr loudly and without restraint. In the morning he treated me with exaggerated coldness, but I was not cheated into believing that his friendliness had been a dream. There are possibilities about Kim, and I believe that if he were to stop with me for 2 years, we should come to a very tolerable understanding. End of section 24.
Section 25 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. Section 25. On Pirates. Of the nameless classics which were of so much concern to all of us when we were young, the most important were certainly those salt and blusterous volumes that told of pirates. It was in vain for kindly relatives to give us books on Nelson and his like, for their craft, beautiful though they might be to the eye, had ever the moralities lurking between decks, and if we met them, it was only that we might make their crews walk the plank, and add new stores of guns and treasure to the crimson vessel with the sinister flag which it was our pleasure to command. And yet the books that gave us this splendid dominion, where are they now? In truth, I cannot say. Examination of recent boys' books has convinced me that the old spirit is lacking, for if pirates are there, it is only as the hapless victims of horrible British crews with every virtue save that one which youth should cherish most, the revolutionary spirit. Who would be a midshipman when he might be a pirate? Yet all the books would have it so, and even Mr. Kenneth Graham, who knows everything that is worth knowing, does not always take the right side in such matters. The grown-up books are equally unsatisfactory to the inquiring mind. Treasure Island, which is sometimes loosely referred to as if it were a horn book for young pirates, hardly touches the main problems of pirate life at all. Stevenson's consideration for youth and the fond parent made him leave out all oaths. No ships are taken, no lovely females captured, nobody walks the plank, and Captain John Silver, for all the maimed strength and masterfulness that Henley suggested to the author, falls lamentably short of what a pirate should be. Captain Teach, of the Sarah in The Master of Ballantrae, is better, and there were the makings of a very good pirate captain in the master himself, but this section of the book is too short to supply our requirements. The book must be all pirates. Defoe's Captain Singleton repents and is therefore disqualified, and Marryat's pirate is, as Stevenson said, written in sand with a salt spoon. Mr. Clark Russell, in one of his romances, ingeniously melts a pirate who has been frozen for a couple of centuries into life, but though he promises well at first, his is but a torpid ferocity, and ends as it began, in words. Nor are the histories of the pirates more satisfying. Captain Johnson's History of Notorious Pirates I have not seen, but anyone who wishes to lose an illusion can read the trial of William Kidd and a few of his companions in the state trials of the year 1701. The captain of the Adventure Galley appears to have done little to merit the name of pirate beyond killing his gunner with a bucket, and the miserable results of his pilferings bear no relationship to the enormous hoard associated with his name in the Gold Bug of Poe, though there is certainly a familiar note in finding included among his captives a number of barrels of sugar candy, which were divided in shares among the crew, the captain himself having 40 shares. The Turkish pirates, mentioned in Purchas, cut a very poor figure. You can read there how 4 English youths overcame a prize crew of 13 men who had been put in the ship Jacob. In a storm they slew the pirate captain, for with the handle of a pump they gave him such a palt on the pate as made his brains forsake the possession of his head. They then killed 3 of the other pirates with cuttle-axes, and brought the ship safely into Spain, where they sold the 9 Turks for galley slaves for a good sum of money, and, as I think, a great deal more than they were worth. Not thus would the chronicles have described the pirates who fought and caroused with such splendid devotion in my youth. To die beneath the handle of a pump is an unworthy end for a pirate captain. The History of the Buccaneers of America, written by a brother of Fanny Burney, a book which was the subject of one of Mr. Andrew Lang's appreciative essays, is nearer the mark, for among other notable fellows mentioned therein is one François Lolonois, who put to death a whole crew of a Spanish ship, 90 men, by beheading them, performing himself the office of executioner. One of the gentlemen in this book turned buccaneer in order to pay his debts, while it is told of another that he shot one of his crew in church for behaving irreverently during Mass. Sir Henry Morgan and Richard Sawkins performed some pretty feats of piracy, but their main energies were concerned in the sacking of towns, and the whole book suffers from an unaccountable prejudice which the author displays against the brave and hard-working villains of whom he writes. In truth, these real pirates are disappointing men to meet. They are usually lacking in fierceness and in fidelity to the pirate ideals of courage and faithfulness to their comrades, while the fine nobility of character which was never absent from those other pirates is unknown in the historical kind. Few, if any, of them merit the old Portuguese punishment for pirates, which consisted in hanging them from the yards of their own ship, and setting the latter to drift with the winds and waves without rudder or sails, an example for rogues and a source of considerable danger to honest mariners. If that were a fitting end for great knaves, the meaner ruffians must be content with the pump handle and the bucket. It is hard if our hearts may not go out to those gloomy vessels, with their cargoes of gold and courage and rum, that sail, it seems, the mental seas of youth no more. Were they really bad for us, those sanguinary tussles, those starlit nights of dissipation? A pinafore would wipe away a deal of blood, and the rum, though we might drink it boiling like quilp, in no wise lessened our interest in home-made cake. But these regrets are of yesterday, and to-day I must draw what consolation I may from the kindly comment of Mr. Lang. Alluring as the pirate's profession is, we must not forget that it had a seamy side, and was by no means all rum and pieces of eight. And there is something repulsive to a generous nature in roasting men because they will not show you where to steal hogs. End of section 25. Recording by Philip Gould.
Section 26 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Miheva. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. The Flute Player. He used to play to me in the magic hour before bedtime, when in the summer the red sun threw long shadows across the lawn, and in winter the fire burned brighter and brighter in the hearth. This was the hour when all the interminable squabbles of the schoolroom were forgotten, and even the noisiest of us would hush his voice to listen drowsily to a fairy tale, or to watch the palaces raise aloft their minarets and crumble to dull ash in the heart of the fire. It was then that I would see him sitting astride of the fire-guard and puffing out his cheeks over his shining flute. Even in the most thrilling moments of fairy stories, when Cinderella lost her crystal slipper, or Sister Anne saw the cloud of dust from the summit of Bluebeard's tower, his shrill melodies would ring in my ears and quicken my sleepy senses with the desire to hear more of this enchanted music. I knew that it was real magic, but I didn't find it strange, because as far as I knew I had heard it all my life. Perhaps he had played to me when I yet lay in my cradle and watched the night light winking on the nursery ceiling, but I didn't try to remember whether this was so. I was content to accept my strange musician as a fact of my existence, and to feel a sense of loss on the rare evenings when he failed me. I didn't know how to dance, but sometimes I would tap my feet on the floor in time to the music, till someone would tell me not to fidget, for no one else would either see him or hear him, which proved that it was real magic, and flattered my sense of possession. It was evident that he came for me alone. The years passed, and in due course the imaginative graces of my childhood were destroyed by the boys of my own age at school. They compelled me to exchange 100 star-roofed palaces, 3 distinct kingdoms of dreams, and my enchanted flute player for a threadbare habit of mimicry that left me cold and unprotected from the winds in the large places of life. There was something at once pathetic and ridiculous in our childish efforts to imitate our elders, but as it seemed that our masters and grown-up relatives were in the conspiracy to make us materialistically wise before our time, a boy would have needed a rare force of character to linger with his childhood and refuse to ape the man. So for a while I saw my glad musician no more, though sometimes I thought I heard him playing far away, and the child within me was warmed and encouraged even while my new-found manhood was condemning the weakness. I knew now that no man worthy of the name was escorted through life by a fairy flute player, and that dreamers and wool-gatherers invariably sank to be poets and musicians, persons who wear bowler hats with frock coats, have no crease in their trousers, and come to a bad end. Fortunately, all education that is repressive rather than stimulating is only skin deep, and it was inevitable that sooner or later I should meet the flute player again. One Saturday afternoon in high summer I avoided cricket and went for a long walk in the woods, moved by a spirit of revolt against all the traditions and conventions of boy life. And presently, in a mossy clearing, all splashed and wetted by little pools of sunlight, I found him playing to an audience of 2 squirrels and a redstart. When he saw me, he winked the eye that glittered over his parading fingers, as though he had left me only 5 minutes before, but I hadn't listened long before I realized that I must pay the price of my infidelity. It was the old music and the old magic, but try as I might, I couldn't hear it so clearly as I had when I was a child. The continuity of my faith had been broken, and though he was willing to forgive, I myself couldn't forget those dark years of doubt and denial, and while I often met him in the days that followed, I never won back to the old childish intimacy. I sought his company eagerly and listened passionately to his piping, but I was conscious now that this was a strange thing, and sometimes when he saw by my eyes that I was moved by wonder rather than by the love of beauty, he would put his flute in his pocket and disappear. The world is an enchanted place only to the incurious and tranquil-minded. Nevertheless, though like all boys I had been forced to discard my childish dreams before I had really finished with them, the lovely melodies of the flute player served to enrich my later years at school with much of the old enchantment. Often enough he would play to me at night during preparation, and I would spend my time in trying to set words to his tunes instead of doing my lessons. It was then that I regretted the lost years that had dulled my ear and prevented me from winning the inmost magic of his song, compared with which my verses seemed but the shadow of a shadow. Yet I saw that he was content with my efforts, and gradually made the discovery that while great achievement is granted to the fortunate, it's the fine effort that justifies a man to himself. What did it matter whether my songs were good or bad? They were the highest expression I could find for the rapture of beauty that had filled my heart as a child, when I had been gifted to see life with clean and truthful eyes. For the songs the flute player played to me were the great dreams of my childhood, the dreams that a wise man prolongs to the day of his death. I do not hear him often now, for I have learnt my lesson, and though my hands tremble and my ear deceives me, I am by way of being a flute player myself. This article, it is clear, is a child's dream, and so have been and will be, I hope, all the articles I shall ever write. What else should we write about? We have learnt a few long words since we grew up, and a few crimes, but no new virtues. That is why I like to get back to the nursery floor, and play with the old toys and think the old thoughts. We knew intuitively then a number of beautiful truths that circumstance appears to deny now, and we grown men are the poorer in consequence. It's folly to find life ugly when the flute lies within our reach, and we can pipe ourselves back to the world of beauty with a song made of an old dream. As for the flute player, if I see him no more with wakeful eyes, I know that he is never very far away. Likely enough, one of these wintry evenings, in the hour before bedtime, when the fire burns brighter and brighter in the hearth, I shall look up and see him sitting astride of the fireguard and puffing out his cheeks over his shining flute. Not many nights ago, I heard someone playing the flute out in the street, and I went down and found a poor fellow blowing his heart out for a sou. There was not much enchantment about him. He had been dismissed from a music hall orchestra for drinking red wine to excess, but he was a real flute player, and I could well imagine that such a man might be driven to intemperance by the failure to achieve those unheard melodies, not to be detected by the sensual ear. To be a bad flute player must be rather like being a bad poet, a joyous but sadly finite life. He was a sad dog, this earthly musician, and he frankly conceived the ideal state as a kind of communal bodega where thirsty souls could find peace and satiety. I gave him 5 pence to help him on his way, and left him to make doleful music in the night till he had enough money to supply his crimson dreams. But he ought not to have said that my flute player was only an amateur. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Day Before Yesterday. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Miheva. The Day Before Yesterday by Richard Middleton. The Wool Gatherer. When he walked down the streets with his head drooping towards the pavement and his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat, the grown-ups would say, "There goes poor Mr. X, wool gathering as usual," and we children used to wonder what he did with all the wool and where he found it to gather. Perhaps he collected it from the thorn bushes whereon the sheep had scratched themselves, or perhaps, being a magician, he had found a way to shear the flocks that we often saw in the sky on fine and windy days. At all events, for a while, his strange calling made us regard him with interest as a man capable of doing dark and mysterious things. Then the grown-ups tried to dispel our illusions by explaining that they only meant that he was absent-minded, a dreamer, an awful warning to young folk who had their way to make in the world. This admirable moral lesson, like most of their moral lessons, failed because they didn't appreciate the subtlety of our minds. We saw that the wool-gatherer did no recognizable work, wore comfortably untidy clothes, walked in the mud as much as he wanted to, and in fine lived a life of enviable freedom, and we thought that on the whole, when we grew up, we should like to be wool-gatherers too. Even the phrase absent-minded excited our admiration, for we knew that it would be a fine thing if our thoughts could travel in foreign countries, where there are parrots and monkeys loose in the woods, while our bodies were imprisoned in the schoolroom under the unsympathetic supervision of the governess of the moment. Although we no longer credited him with being a magician, the tardy explanations of the grown-ups had, if anything, increased his glamour. It seemed to us that he must be very wise. He lived in an old house a little way out of the town, and the house stood in a garden after our own heart. We knew by the shocked comments of our elders that it had formerly been cut and trimmed like all the other gardens with which we were acquainted. But it was now a perfect wilderness, a delightful place. My brother and I got up early one morning when the dew was on the world and explored it thoroughly. We found a goat in an outhouse, and could see the marks in the meadow that had once been a lawn where he was tethered during the day. The wool-gatherer was evidently in the habit of sitting under a tree that stood at one corner, for the earth was pitted with holes that had been made by the legs of his chair. Being a wise man, we thought it probable that he conversed with his goat, and could understand the answers of that pensive animal, who wagged his beard at us when we peeped shyly into his den. In the long grass by the tree we found a book, bound like a school prize, lying quite wet with the dew. It was full of cabalistic signs, and we took care to leave it where we found it, lest it should be black magic, though now I would support the theory that Mr. X read his Homer in the original. Taking it all together, it was the most sensible garden we had ever seen, with plenty of old fruit trees, but with none of those silly flower beds that incommode the careless feet of youth. Our expedition enhanced our opinion of the wool-gatherer's wisdom. Here at least was a grown-up person who knew how to live in a decent fashion, and when he ambled by us in the market-place, his muddy boots dripping on the cobbles, and the pockets of his green-grey overcoat pulled down by the weight of his hands, our eyes paid him respectful tribute. He really served a useful purpose in our universe, for he showed us that it was possible to grow old without going hopelessly to the bad. Sometimes, considering the sad lives of our elders, who did of their own free will all the disagreeable things that we were made to do by force, we had been smitten with the fear that in the course of years we too would be afflicted with this melancholy disease. The wool-gatherer restored our confidence in ourselves. If he could be grown up without troubling to be tidy or energetic, why, then so could we. It amused us to feel that our affronted rulers were itching to give him a good talking to, and to send him off to brush his clothes and his boots. But he was beyond the reach of authority, this splendid man. And one of these days we thought that we too would enjoy this delightful condition of freedom, for like many grown men and women, we didn't realize that liberty is a state of mind and not an environment. We had never seen the inside of his house, but we could imagine what it was like. No doubt he kept his servants in proper order, and didn't allow them to tidy up, so that his things lay all over the room where he could find them when he wanted them. He had a friendly cat with whom we were acquainted, so that he would not lack company, and probably on wet days, when he couldn't go out into the garden, he had the goat in to play with him. He went to bed when he liked, and got up when he liked, and had cake for every meal instead of common bread. A man like that would be quite capable of having a sweet shop in one of the rooms, with a real pair of scales, so that he could help himself whenever he wanted to. Whenever our own lives grew a little dull, we played at being the wool-gatherer. But although he occupied such a large part of our thoughts, we never dared to speak to him, because we were afraid of his extraordinary wisdom. This was not our normal reason for avoiding the society of grown-up people. When one day a funeral passed us in the street, and we were told that it was the wool-gatherers, we shook our heads sceptically. The coffin was quite new and shiny, and all the horses had their hoofs neatly blacked, and we thought we knew our man better than that. But as day followed day, and we met him no more, our doubts were overcome, and we knew that he was dead. After a while his will was published in the local newspaper, and the grown-ups were greatly impressed, because it seemed that he had been very rich and had left all his money to hospitals. Secretly we patronized him for their tardy discovery of our man's worth. It hadn't needed any newspaper to tell us that he was remarkable. But when some new people took his house and cut down all the bushes and tidied up the garden, we were really hurt, and began to realize what we had lost. Where should we play now these hot nights of summer, when the hours passed so slowly and we couldn't sleep? They had made his beautiful wilderness as dull as our own, and our dreams must find a new playground. We never heard what happened to the goat. Now that I am myself grown up, though children occasionally flatter me by treating me as an equal, I revert sometimes to our earliest thoughts and wonder what the wool-gatherer did with all his wool. Perhaps he wove it into blankets for the poor dreamless ones of the world. They are many, for it is not so easy to be absent-minded as people think. In the first place, it is necessary to have a mind. It is wrong also to believe that wool-gatherers fill no useful place in life. I have shown how Mr. X, lost in his world of dreams, was yet of real service to us as children, and in the same way I think that we who live the hurried life derive genuine satisfaction from the spectacle of the dreamers sauntering by. If they serve no other purpose, they are at least milestones by aid of which we can estimate our own speed, and if no one were idle, we would win no credit from our marvellous energy. Also they are happy, and the philosopher will always hesitate to condemn the way of life of a man who succeeds in that task. Perhaps we should all be better off gathering wool. End of section 27.